You know the story. It's one of the most famous and honestly, most debated stories in human history. A giant flood, a massive ark, and one family chosen to survive it all. It's this epic tale of judgment, of survival, and of a brand new start. But how are we supposed to think about it today? Is it literal history, a miracle, or maybe something else entirely?
So what are we really dealing with here? Are we talking about a literal, historical event that basically wiped the planet clean? Or is it more of a cultural memory? Of a real but much more localized catastrophe? Or could it be a timeless myth? A story we tell ourselves to make sense of the world and our place in it? These are the huge questions we're going to dive into. Okay, but before we even start looking for sunken arcs or sediment layers, we've got to ask a more fundamental question. Why was this story told in the first place? Because from a theological perspective, especially when you look at the Quran, this story is so much more than just a historical report. It's really a profound moral lesson.
For its original audience, this story was doing a lot of heavy lifting. I mean, think about it. For early Muslims who were facing persecution, it was a huge source of comfort. It showed them that, hey, even prophets face rejection. It's also a lesson in patience, a serious warning about where corruption can lead, and this deep assurance that history isn't just random chaos, it's guided by divine justice.
And this brings us to a really powerful core message, which the Quranic version makes crystal clear. You see, in that telling, Noah's own son actually refuses to get on the ark, and he drowns. That is a massive and pretty unique detail. The point is impossible to miss. Your family name can't save you. Salvation comes down to your own faith and your own actions, period.
All right, so now let's zoom out a bit and look at the bigger historical picture. Because the story of a world-destroying flood, it's not at all unique to the Abrahamic faiths. Actually, it's one of the most common stories you can find in ancient cultures all over the world.
Just look at this timeline for a second. The Mesopotamian Epic of Gilgamesh, which has a strikingly similar flood story, predates the biblical version by over 1,000 years. That tells you that the idea of a great flood was already baked into the cultural DNA of the ancient Near East, long before it was ever written down in Genesis or the Quran.
And yeah, while the basic plot points are similar, a warning, a big boat, saving the animals, the details and, more importantly, the reasons are critically different. In Gilgamesh, the gods are just petty and they're annoyed because humans are being too loud. But in Genesis and the Quran, the flood is a direct response to moral corruption. The Quranic version in particular really zeroes in on the message of monotheism and the prophet's struggle, taking that ancient story and reframing it for its own core message.
So why are these stories so similar? Well, there are basically two major ways to look at this. The academic view suggests a kind of cultural telephone game. A powerful story was told and retold, and it got adapted over centuries to fit new beliefs. The Islamic view, on the other hand, sees it as confirmation, that a single, real event did happen, and the Quran came to set the record straight to restore the true version of that story that had gotten twisted in older myths.
And that, of course, brings us to the elephant in the room. Is there any physical evidence for a great flood? This is where we pivot from theology and history and start talking about geology, archaeology, and, the hard data.
Now, it's absolutely crucial that we make a distinction right here. When people say Noah's flood, they could be talking about two very different things. One is a global flood that submerged the entire planet, Mount Everest and all. The other is a massive but regional flood that wiped out the entire known world of a specific ancient people. We have to be clear. These are two totally different claims.
So let's start with that global flood idea. When scientists went looking for evidence, they knew exactly what they'd find if it happened. A single planet-wide flood would leave a very specific signature, a distinct, uniform layer of sediment in the rock record everywhere. But after decades of looking on every single continent, the scientific consensus is clear. That layer just isn't there.
Okay, so what about the poles? Well, scientists can drill deep into the ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica. They pull up these ice cores that are like perfect little time capsules, giving us a year-by-year record of the climate going back hundreds of thousands of years. And what do they show? A continuous, uninterrupted history. There's no break, no sign of them ever being submerged in some worldwide ocean.
And finally, the evidence is literally written in our own DNA. Think about it. If all of humanity and all the animals were reduced to just the pairs on an ark a few thousand years ago, that would create what's called an extreme genetic bottleneck. But geneticists just don't see that. Instead, our DNA shows this incredible diversity that points to a continuous, large population, not one that had to restart from a handful of survivors.
But, and this is a huge but, This is where things get really interesting. While science has found zero evidence for a global flood, there is absolutely compelling evidence for massive, civilization-ending regional floods. Archaeologists digging in modern-day Iraq have found these thick layers of river silt, some of them 8 feet deep, that completely buried ancient Sumerian cities. For the people living there, a flood of that scale was the end of the world.
So, how in the world do we put all of this together? We've got this powerful theological story, a deep ancient history of similar myths, and a scientific picture that seems to support huge local catastrophes, but not a global one. Let's try to synthesize all these different perspectives.
Now, from a purely skeptical point of view, some pretty major questions come up. First, the logistics. How could a wooden boat possibly hold millions of species? Then there are the ethical concerns. What does it mean to punish innocent children and animals right alongside the guilty? And sociologically, you could ask, isn't this story just a powerful tool to enforce obedience by threatening divine destruction? These are the main objections you'll hear from a non-believing perspective.
So when you boil it all down, there are essentially 3 main ways to approach this story today. The traditionalist view takes it as a factual, historical account of a miracle. The modernist view tries to harmonize faith with science, suggesting it's a divine story about a real, but regional, disaster. And finally, the secular view sees it as a powerful myth history. And that doesn't mean it's a lie. It means it's a cultural memory of a real trauma,